And welcome to this second session in our Law Council of Australia series on artificial intelligence. We've got people joining through the waiting room, so I might just do a brief introduction as people come in and join us. It is my absolute pleasure to introduce two experts from Stirling and Rose. We have Natasha Blycha, Managing Director, and Schellie-Jayne Price, Partner, both Stirling and Rose. This session, AI legal and commercial issues, and I'm told with a sprinkling of ethics, is really important for helping us to set the scene on what we should be paying attention to. I won't steal the thunder of our guest speakers. I will give you a brief introduction to both of them. Some of you may know Natasha Blycha. She's part of the Law Council's Digital Commerce Committee and also sits on the Financial Services Committee. She's a leading expert on blockchain and digital assets, Web3, digital ethics and human rights, and we have had the pleasure of working together for several years before she went off to take over the world at Stirling and Rose. She was awarded Financial Times Most Innovative Lawyer and Lawyers Weekly Thought Leader of the Year. So needless to say, she has a vision for what's coming, and her insights will be really, really useful for us today. Schellie-Jayne Price, SJ, brings her real-world experience in managing the development and implementation of machine learning applications in the resource sector. So really practical experience here, over 20 years of legal experience in resources companies with multi-billion-dollar projects and all sorts of important things that really look at the application of technology on the ground. She has a comprehensive understanding of machine learning, digitization, and industry experience, which helps her to provide insightful and practical advice on AI. So really leading the charge there on the legal advisory side. I'm super excited to hear from our experts today. We're building on the session we had last week, which some of you may have joined, where we heard from Microsoft CTO Lee Hicken, who gave a really insightful explanation of how some of these generative AI systems and tools work. And this is, as I said, the second in a series of 5. So the next session we will have a deep dive, the next 2 sessions will be a deep dive into privacy and IP issues quite specifically. And in our final session, we'll hear from our human rights experts from the Human Technology Institute, which was set up by the former Human Rights Commissioner, Edward Santo, and his colleague, Nick. So that's another really interesting angle on the way that AI is being developed and deployed here in Australia. So that's enough from me. Please do use the Q&A function. We love to record the questions, and that can help us shape any follow-up kind of communications or sessions. And then I think Natasha and SJ would like you to interact throughout this session using the chat, but I'll leave that to them. Over to you both.
Thank you.
Good afternoon. Hello, world. As Susanna said, thank you, Susanna, and thank you to the Law Council for having us. You know, this is, I'm guessing, based on having also watched Lee's presentation last week, that there's a few of you who attended that session that had their appetite whet and are attending this session. So for those of you, hopefully we're building from a slightly different perspective, from a lawyer's perspective and a commercial perspective on the idea of generative models and also of AI, traditional or narrow AI. So we're going to build on that, but also we're going to start again at the basics for those of you who didn't attend Lee's talk last week. So I thought about last night, I was trying to explain to my children what I was going to talk about today. And so then I thought, well, you know what? Sometimes it's just easier to give a really basic, familiar analog that might help us to get some of these ideas in our mind more easily. So the talk that we're going to give you today is to ask the question, basically, who for art thou? And that is AI, what is this new AI? And I intentionally have used the word who, which is meant to be the magic dust sprinkling of ethics that you get through this presentation, is to ask who is there any future for AI personhood, which is an interesting legal question I want you to keep in the back of your mind throughout this presentation. And then we're going to go back to the basics. Then we're going to talk about commercial applications, because if anyone is a lawyer in the audience, which I imagine most people are, there's the question you need to ask, which is, why do I care? And a lot of the why you should care is obviously a productivity, commercial, employment, and other practical issues about what documents, for example, that you should be looking at in order to determine how these technologies can be brought into institution, government, and law firms. And then there's just looking at what's happening around the traps. And it's a dangerous game to be the person who has to tell you what's happening in different jurisdictions, because one thing I can assure you is this area of law is changing so dramatically, so quickly, that to the extent there is any law, and the hint is there's not a lot of law here, but to the extent there is any law, it almost can't keep up. So the laws that are hard laws in the EU that have been put together, they're struggling a little bit to also deal with generative AI. Then we'll talk a little bit about risk. At Stirling and Rose, we're emerging technology lawyers. So using SJ's language, we do try to body swerve risk, even though that, not body swerve risk, body swerve fear is what I should have said. We try to approach risk in a mitigating fashion without just saying, oh my God, the world's about to fall into a dystopian nightmare. That is possible, but that's hopefully not what you feel like at the end of the presentation. And the last thing, if we get there, is we're going to talk about productivity. And you should have, yeah, I think you've been given a lovely introduction from Susanna, but Stirling and Rose, this is what we do. We sit at we are gluttons for punishment. We like to talk about the law that is at the edge, what's coming next. So before I actually talk about this slide, I want to ask you to come with me on a mental journey and think about the difference between the AI that has been described as part of the AI winter. Everyone's known AI is there, but it hasn't lived up to its potential for some time. And then I want to compare and contrast that with generative AI, also known as foundation models, also known as large language models. Technically, these definitions are all still in a bit of flux. And if you read widely, you'll see people using these definitions differently. So just bear with me. But if you hear generative AI, large language models, those things tend to be foundation models. They tend to be talking about the second category of AI, which is part of the AI spring or summer. So I'm going to try to create for you an analog that helpfully makes the distinction between narrow AI and generative AI. So narrow AI that we've had for some time is the equivalent, if you will, of going into a house. And in that house is a room. And that room is full of shoes. And forgive me, maybe I'm showing my own proclivities by making this about a shoe example. But in that room, it's full of shoes. And inside there are shelves and shelves of shoes. And some of the shoes are sneakers, some of them are baby shoes, some are high heels. What narrow AI basically has been able to do to date, it has been, with the help of me, going into that room and into those shelves, I have labelled different lots of those shoes as high heels, some of them as baby shoes, and some of them as sneakers, etc., etc. And the AI inside that narrow domain of that room, what it's been able to do is establish patterns and tell me, do you know you're most likely to have a set of shoes on every third shelf? Or see patterns. Actually, you always have pink shoes to the right of the room. Okay, so I'm trying to use a facetious example to explain to you what narrow AI is. Why is this generative AI so astonishing and so game-changing? Because what this generative AI is the equivalent of blowing the room open. Now you are in the whole house, and that house just isn't full of shoes. That house is full of lemons and books and beds and furniture and shoes. All of those things are in a normal house, if you will. And inside that house, I walk in and I say to generative AI, could you please make me a set of baby shoes with high heels? I put forward a prompt to the AI. I have not trained the AI. I've not had to label things that are shoes in my house. And the AI, if you will, produces me a digital copy of shoes. Okay, so it's a builder. It actually built the shoes. From seeing everything in there, it looked for patterns. It has this transformational capability, this transformer capability that SJ will talk about, where it starts to see, for example, that shoes tend to sit near legs. So it looks at things of being able to look at this whole house. So we're going to go into more detail, but if you keep those examples in your head as we're going through, you can see that the generative or these new generative models or large language models, that's a game changer. That's something extraordinarily different to just being able to look and patterns, which is all brilliant inside a specific domain. It's a very big different thing. Now, in the world, as you're going to see, there are lots of different houses. Okay, there are lots of different companies, which we're going to look in detail, who have gathering together different houses. And inside those houses, instead of just saying there is shoes and trees and lemons, well, not trees, but books and beds, is data. Okay, so that's the big takeaway. So now, this is your sprinkling of ethics and a big foundational question to start the presentation. Who is AI? So that question got me thinking, and I was back at that scene in Good Will Hunting, where you have Matt Damon, who's very, very clever, who's a genius, in fact, but he's had no life. Okay, you could say he's disembodied in a way because he hasn't experienced many things. And the character who's played by Robin Williams, when he has quite a forthright Good Will Hunting, speak to him rudely and from his genius perspective about life, actually have this quote that you can see on the screen. And effectively he said, you don't know anything just because you read it in a book. Okay. There are many people who are going to ask the question, what is my relevance? What is the role of workers? What are we as people when we move into a world where basically AI can start to do many of the things that we have done to date, and also to be better than us in terms of the actual facilities, memory, cognition, the things that we used to say somebody was smart. In many ways, AI will be smarter. But the actual difference here is, has AI been embodied yet? Will be. More to come on that. But what we want you to see here, you know, I'd love to see a show of hands, or just to understand how many people in the audience are playing with these large language models already through ChatGPT. Hopefully everybody is by now. But if you look at this example, I have put this same quote into GPT-4. So I've bought Pro mode, and I said to GPT-4, in our house, we tend to call ChatGPT Chatty. So I said to Chatty, let's take that scene from Good Will Hunting, but instead of it being a discussion between Matt Damon and Robin Williams, how about it's just a discussion between me and you? Okay, so then I placed the text inside. And as you can see, this is the text that Chatty came back to me with. And I get you to turn your attention to the words in bold, a little bit emotive, and look at you. I don't see an intelligent, confident AI. I see a cocky, scared, codeless machine, but you're a genius. No one denies that. No one could possibly understand the depths of you. But for you to presume to know anything about me because you've analysed my text input and ripped my life apart. You're an AI, right? You think I know the first thing about how hard life has been, how you feel, who you are, because I've read GPT-4. As I said, we're going up, we're going to go up and we're going to go down through this presentation. But the interesting thing with the sprinkling of ethics I want you to take away here is when I put this in and this came back, I actually felt sad. So the impact on me in reading that text is I felt sorry for the large language model, which is an incredibly crazy feeling, but it was a real feeling. And I also want you to think, as we go through this presentation, what is the role of the law in moderating something that may take on legal personhood in the future that has no feelings? It only has the ability to mimic feeling and doesn't have a body. So it doesn't have what I call that microbiome type, parasitic type, bacterial load, the feeling, the fall of your stomach when you fall in love, all of those things. It doesn't have shame. It doesn't have anger. But it can mimic ours, as we've seen. So we're up, and now we're going to come down. And I will hand over to Schellie-Jayne.
Thanks a lot, Natasha. Our vision for what we want to achieve in this session is We want to get lawyers involved in this really important conversation about AI and about our society. And as we go through talking about AI in this presentation, we want you to think, as Natasha has suggested, about what is the future going to look like, and what do we want the future to look like, and what should we be doing about that? So that's my high level. And now I'm going to talk a little bit about the types of machine learning. And I think understanding the types of machine learning is very informative to having this conversation. So let's start off with artificial intelligence. There are so many different definitions of artificial intelligence. In fact, even the experts don't agree about what it is. But for the purposes of today, let's just say that artificial intelligence is where you have machines that are capable of doing things that usually require human intelligence. And that's certainly the sort of artificial intelligence that we're seeing in applications like ChatGPT. Now, underlying all of these different artificial intelligences, there is a sub-branch of artificial intelligence called machine learning. And this, from my perspective, is the most exciting, but also the most scary types of AI. And that's because with machine learning, you don't actually have a human programmer who is sitting down at the computer typing the code. What you have is you have a learning algorithm into which you feed data or experience. And that learning algorithm recognizes the patterns, creates statistical models, and builds its own system. So machine learning is very valuable for circumstances where the rules are so incredibly complex that it would take a human a really long time to actually figure out what they are in order to hard code it. In fact, machine learning is capable of identifying patterns in data that are completely invisible to humans. And there are two really interesting examples from medicine. Plain film X-rays of chests actually can be identified with the patient's race. That's something humans can't do. And ECG, so this is the heart ECGs, you know, the sort of wobbly lines. AI can actually identify gender from that. So what they're looking for in computer vision is really they're looking pixel by pixel and are able to identify patterns. Now, computer vision, which is seeing patterns in pictures, has been something that actually has been around for quite some time and has been really deeply investigated and used. And I want to unpack that a little bit by just talking about types of machine learning techniques. I want to start with supervised learning. And perhaps the easiest way to describe what this is to describe the first machine learning tool that I built. And this was a classifier model. And all it was trained to do was to identify and classify dogs from cats. It wasn't trained to identify anything else. And the way I did that was uploaded hundreds and hundreds of pictures of dogs and labeled them dogs. Uploaded hundreds and hundreds of pictures of cats and labeled them cats. So in supervised learning, you actually need a human to attach the labels to the pictures. And of course, you can imagine if you label those pictures erroneously, you're going to have a problem. Or if you deploy that model for cats and dogs to identify meerkats, it's not going to know what to do. So supervised learning is when you have labeled data and then you feed it into the model and it looks at the patterns that are described by that data. And it identifies the distinguishing nature between dogs and cats, which we do as humans very easily. But if you think about writing the rules, it would be incredibly difficult because they all have legs. They usually all have tails and two eyes and a nose and a mouth. There's really a lot of similarities. So that's supervised learning. I want to give you just a few real-world examples about how it's used. So one of the ways that supervised learning has been used in the real world is in Western Australia. Western Power has a problem that sometimes the electricity has fires on the poles for transmission, and that ultimately ends up in a blackout, something very bad. So in Western Power, they actually use supervised learning by inputting constellations of data that were associated with pole top fires. And it included the type of poles, the type of transmissions, the type of weather that had been recently around the area, the wind direction and precipitation. And all of those things together, they concatenated with this constellation of circumstances, pole top fire. This constellation of circumstances, not pole top fire. And that enabled them to create a model that was capable of predicting where a pole top fire might occur, so they could proactively send out a team to actually intervene and prevent blackouts. So here's an example where supervised learning makes a real difference in the real world. Now, unsupervised learning is a bit like what we all have with Netflix recommendations. So what happens with supervised learning is large data sets are put into the learning algorithm without any labeling. And the learning algorithm is told, just find me clusters, right? Just do lots of different clusters, and I'll look through all the different ones you have, and I'll find one that works, one that will work for my circumstances. So for example, it might cluster the people who maybe like to watch the law show Rake and Fisk. Maybe they also like to watch Suits and so on. So you would have it clustering the types of people who like certain types of shows, and that enables you to make a recommendation system. And we see recommendation systems everywhere. The other application in the law for unsupervised learning is as the first step when a big discovery is undertaken, to actually get a feel for what the data is and to look at the clustering of what that data is about. And in discovery, what you often find is that they will start with the unsupervised learning to look at clusters, and then on top of that, they will actually add supervised learning where they'll label data to tell the learning algorithm, actually, this is the sort of stuff that's really relevant to what's going on between the parties. So that's unsupervised learning. Then I want to talk to you about reinforcement learning. And this is really fun, right? This is what they use to actually teach algorithms to play chess and to play AlphaGo. This is a situation where an algorithm learns from experience in the real world. For example, it will play millions upon millions of chess games. And as a result of that, it will work out how to win chess. So they're really three of the most basic types of way that machine learning techniques are used. Now, up until relatively recently, natural language processing was an incredibly difficult computing problem. And that all changed with the creation of transformers, because the key thing that transformers does is that it has an attention mechanism, which enables it to understand linkages between data that is many, many, many tokens or words prior, so that it understands the language of the meaning of language. And that is what has made the hugest difference in generative AI and in natural language processing. I'm just going to ask Natasha if you wouldn't mind just moving to the next slide. So these are the transformers models, and it's just been the most amazing explosion. I've been following natural language processing since before transformers, when people were using recurrent neural networks, and it was simply not appropriate to use. It really didn't deliver the sorts of things that we want it to deliver. In particular, the use of previous models meant that humans like me, we had to annotate a lot of data in order to teach the learning algorithm. With transformers, you actually have the learning algorithm looking at this tremendous body of data and figuring out what the patterns are. And I'll give you an example. GPT-3, which is the progenitor to ChatGPT, we know that that was trained on the whole of Common Crawl, so the whole of the internet, Wikipedia, and more books than you and I could read in a lifetime. And from that huge amount of data, it identified what are the statistical rules about language in order to statistically predict what is the most likely next word. And that's what's happening with ChatGPT. And it's pretty amazing. In fact, I've been really stunned at the capability of these models and the exponential nature in which they are developing. Now I'm going to hand it back to you, Natasha. Thank you.
you do, SJ, it's fair to say, though, that the outputs of large language models aren't just words, correct? So when you're using large language models, or I like to think of these massive houses that have been aggregated, whether they're from calling the internet, whatever the furniture and contents of these large houses are, is that the contents of these houses is also allowing you to code. They're also allowing for image generation. They're allowing even videography. So it's not just that you can make a story about a shoe using the primary example from the start, or a policy document about shoes. It's not just that you can summarize a shoe paper. It's that you can actually start to create these three-dimensional objects of shoes, if you will, that are far more, there's math. There is this ability to self-generate itself. That's what the big surprising difference is of generative AI. Thank you, SJ. So,
if I can build on that, I think that's a really important point, because I think some people mistake what's happening with GPT-3 and 4 with search and actually going and finding something and bringing it back to you. That is not what's happening. It's actually creating something new. That's why it's called generative.
That's right.
And it's the same thing with Stable Diffusion and Midjourney. What it's using is it's using transformers for the language prompts, and then it's using Stable Diffusion to actually generate something completely new. And you'll see actually from the slides we're showing you today, these have all been generated by Midjourney. So they have been generated by a generative model.
100%. So one of the things that Stirling Rose that we found is that there's so many models, and there's so many new words that we're all trying to get our heads around, and there's so many different technological providers, some new, some old, that we thought that would probably be really useful to the audience to try to just create a bit of a map of who's doing what, and then you can apply that back to perhaps the products that you're using back at the office, and have an understanding of what you need to waitlist for, what's good, what's bad, what's ugly, what's scary, what you're going to be giving away your firstborn child in data to, and proprietary rights and confidential information to use. So this map, or this table that we're going to go through with you, please don't take this to be the gospel truth, because as I said before, this changes on a daily basis. So everybody is in an arms race for generative AI. So what I'm going to show you over these is I'm going to show you OpenAI, Meta, NVIDIA, IBM, Amazon, and also the Chinese large tech companies, Baidu, Tencent, Alibaba. I could also show you, I could go on, I could show you Apple, I could show you SAP. Basically, everybody's in the race, but people are doing it differently. I'm not going to start with Google. What I'm actually going to start with is Microsoft, because Microsoft, you could say strategically and commercially, has had an absolute cracker of a time when it's come to large language models, because they have, since 2019, they have done a deal with the makers of ChatGPT. And the makers of ChatGPT are OpenAI. Okay, so OpenAI are effectively the new players on campus. They are the new kids in town, run by a guy called Sam Altman. Quite controversial because it started as a not-for-profit. You might have heard Elon Musk whinging about that they were not-for-profit. He sponsored them at the start. They now have a bit more for profititis. Let's see where that ends up. But anyway, so OpenAI is the inventor, or built the house of GPT. What is GPT-4? So the large language model they built is GPT-4. That's the current house. Okay, that house has what Schellie-Jayne was talking about, that the inside the house, what are the number of parameters? And that's the word you look for a large language model. Facebook will argue with you and say the parameters, it's not all about size, baby. You don't need so many parameters. But the actual biggest, the big boy large language models, OpenAI is very coy about this, but people say that it's GPT-4, which is what's underlying the paid version of ChatGPT now, has over 1 trillion parameters.
And perhaps I could just say a parameter, the best way to talk about a parameter, it's weights and biases that are in the model. And think about it as knobs that you can tweak in the model. So you can imagine having that many knobs that you can tweak is quite astonishing.
Okay, so OpenAI is doing a deal and has been doing a deal with Microsoft since 2019. So you might have seen this in the press, and that's why I'm saying this is strategically very, very clever. So 2019, Satya, CEO of Microsoft, actually said, we will invest $1 billion into OpenAI. Okay, and what did they get in return for doing that? Is they said that they would be the sole distributor of the actual underlying servers or the cloud computing that supports the generative model. So I want you to think about what are the ingredients, what's the recipe you need for a large language model. You need a couple of things. You need a house full of data, but you also need software processing. So this is why this is a marriage made in heaven, because the deal was, we give you $1 billion, you use all of our software processing, use our cloud infrastructure, and then that relationship has become embedded. And if you look at what Microsoft's doing across all of its suites of products, its main AI service has always been through Azure, its cloud platform. But what they're doing now is they're also introducing something new, which hasn't hit the market yet. You can't use it, which is called Copilot, which is effectively taking Chatty, because remember, everything underneath is OpenAI's products, taking Chatty and sticking it into Office 365. So that means you remember we used to have that little pin, that little talking Clippy. It's like sticking Clippy on steroids in all of your Office 365 applications. Also, just to make the point here is that these houses of data, if you will, already for many years you've had Copilot working in GitHub, and that means that that's code being able to give birth to code. So anyone who's been playing around with ChatGPT 3.5 or 4 will tell you the coding is getting better. Just stop for a second there and make this comment, and it goes back to the first slide about whether we're dealing with a school mom or Hal or what we're dealing with, is the same way that the narrow AI models of the past, which are still very much in use all over the world, they took a lot of pre-training. Large language models take a lot of post-training. Okay, so the word that you'll see used here in this final column is reinforcement learning human feedback, or RLHF. And that's quite, I got that acronym right, didn't I, SJ? I think I have. Okay, so RLHF means that people, you and I, when we use these machines and other people, are giving feedback, was that a good answer or not? So you put in a prompt and something comes back, was this good or not good? And the other thing that's happening with these models all the time is they're getting refined. And the reason I may be showing my prejudices, but the school mom point here is that, have you noticed, if you've been using these chat models for some time, that they're becoming increasingly politically correct? And some would say a little bit less exciting. You don't get the whacker of examples you used to put things in 3, where you get really quite quirky answers. Increasingly, the answers are less quirky. So you're getting, basically, we're creating a much more PC voice who, even if you ask a question about anything that's a medical issue, for example, say, go see a doctor, it tries to curate the responses at the end, the user end. Another comment I want to make here is, again, thinking about what you're going to need to do with these machines, is what's happening at the moment with these models is most of us are interacting with ChatGPT or Bing, potentially. Bing, again, is got ChatGPT under the hood, but a bit more of the house of data, if you will, from Microsoft added to it. It's a search engine that is real time. So it's ChatGPT, actually that data set or that house of data at this point stopped in end of 2022. So don't ask it about something that's happened in the last few months. You'll get no answer. But Microsoft under the hood is using Bing, and it gives you up-to-date answers, but they're very, very short answers. Not everyone here will be able to use it because it's waitlisted. But the point is, even in business now, so at Stirling and Rose, or if you're at a resources company, or if you're at another law firm, wherever you are, if you are using a large language model, you're probably using a consumer product. Okay, you're probably not using an enterprise product. So let's follow the money and see who's doing what. So you'll see with Google and Microsoft, and they're all creating these enterprise use or API-based products. So an API call is when you basically take what's inside Acme Co. So we're in Acme Co. We've got a chatty style large language model inside the house, but we're also reaching back out to that massive house with all of that information on it. So they're like conjoined sets of information. And that way we put a line in the middle, which keeps the proprietary information separate. But this dance, if you will, of are we going to keep the large language model inside or work with what's outside, that is what people are going to pay for in the future. And the reality is today, it's actually, well, for example, at Stirling and Rose, we just got in yesterday into the Amazon use case to see on APIs, but it's a thing of putting yourself on wait lists. There's very few organizations, there's like 20 on Microsoft and Google at the moment who are actually in these particular enterprise use first use cases, if you will. So again, so you can see Microsoft is winning. A lot of sour grapes in the tech industry at the moment. People saying, we've been doing this for years. Actually, this is what's between the scenes. Are you OpenAI children? You don't really know all the ethics and hoops we've had to jump through, and you're just putting things out to market that are terrifying. And we've all been dealing with content moderation, and you're not doing that properly. That's kind of what it feels like if you go and read the press releases from all the other companies. So what's Facebook doing? So think about how what the big tech companies' business models are at the moment. As we know, Meta, Facebook has always had a surveillance capitalism model rather than actually charging for the products. It doesn't have a product that's gone. It does have a large language model. It's called Llama. It's supposed to be really good, but it's only open to researchers at the moment. It doesn't have, for example, a product that they're trying to sell into enterprise. But this Llama is something that they're much smaller. So they say, as I said at the start, that it does just as good a job as the larger 1 trillion parameter models, much smaller. So you can deploy them. You have to have a much souped up computer, probably not your computer at home, but not far off it for people to use. And if you've got a bit of tech now, you at home could actually use the Meta Llama model in your own house. So what's interesting about that is an ethical sprinkle here is that these large language models, as I said, they have enormous software processing and power requirements. So remember, people got really excited that blockchain was a nightmare for the environment previously. Believe me, the number of people using ChatGPT, using large language models, that act of scoping the house and checking and seeing what are the patterns of what people do, legs go with shoes and pencils come after erasers, that whole job is extremely power hungry, and the more parameters, the more power hungry. So not surprisingly, some other back-end deals that are going along and people doing really well is NVIDIA, because they actually provide the graphic processors needed in training, deploying software like ChatGPT. And they have 95% of the market for the AI chips. So always think when there's something here, there's hardware and there's software going on at the same time. Interesting, IBM, what they've done is they didn't put out a large language model, and IBM was quite a far ahead in they had Watson years and years ago of a narrow domain model. It's not a large language model though. But what they've created is a product called Seek, which effectively looks at ChatGPT and adds another layer or an application layer to ChatGPT, which actually makes proprietary requests better. So it's an application layer. And same thing from Amazon, IBM, Google, and also Microsoft. They're all creating new applications which will sit on top of the large language models, and the applications allow you to make more applications. Okay, so think about this. This is a progeny point. So the large language models are giving birth to and creating a little bit of human prompting, but they're effectively building themselves. So we're starting to get into this cycle of the smartest person in the world inventing the smartest things in the world. Okay, do you see where this is going? Okay, I think that's probably enough on that. Time-wise, I can see we're getting quite on, but you get the point. I've basically given the US users, but do not think for a second these large language models aren't in other countries. If you look at what's come out of for example, Baidu, Tencent and Alibaba. We know that the Chinese have some of the greatest amounts of data and surveillance to date. You think about the ubiquity of the WeChat platform, WhatsApp, all of those platforms are also being fed into these houses of large language models. With that, SJ, do you want to talk about how we as practitioners can make decisions?
Thanks, Natasha. I think with the evolution of these large language models, organisations have 4 options, right? Option 1 is not to engage, or at least not to engage now. And we've already seen that with education departments saying you're not allowed to use ChatGPT in our organisation. The second option, and a lot of organisations, or at least some, are doing this, and that is they are allowing the members in their organisation to use the consumer version of ChatGPT, right? The third option you have is what Natasha was just talking about, which is actually to pay for an API key to give you access to the GPT model. And then that enables you to train it and do different things to it within your own specific domain area. So in Natasha's analogy, this enables you to take that model into the BHP house or into the Suncorp house or into the law firm house. And we've already seen that with Harvey, right? Where we have a law firm that's actually taken in the model into their house. Now, one that I really think is pretty amazing, and I don't know if you've seen it, is that a company called Casetext in the United States has brought GPT-4 into their house and created an application called Co-Counsel. And there was a fantastic segment on NBC News where they demonstrated, live demonstration, what Co-Counsel can do. They uploaded the report from the January 6th Senate inquiry into the Capitol Hill occurrence, and they asked Co-Counsel to answer some questions. They asked Co-Counsel, what is the evidence that would inculpate Donald Trump? What is the evidence that would exculpate Donald Trump? And give us 10 of the most incriminating tweets. And remember, this is a like 400 and something page document, so not a small document. And it did it really quickly. So that is a really clear example of how someone has actually API'd GPT-4 into their organisation and then used it to customise for their own use case. Now, the fourth option is, and Natasha alluded to this also, is that you have a large language model within your own organisation, so you don't need to do an API call, right? And I know some people who've actually taken Meta's Llama within their own organisation, or even some of them within their own home, and actually trained it to do things. The advantages of doing that are that your data stays within your ecosystem. If you do the API call, your data will go to the Azure cloud and it will be accessed by OpenAI. Now, according to the terms and conditions of the API arrangements that you have. And look, if you're already within the Microsoft environment, you're already putting your data within the Azure cloud in any event. What's interesting with the API call is that you have to execute a data processing agreement, and that data with OpenAI, and that data processing agreement is non-negotiable. Basically, you accept what they offer you, or you can't use the API call. Now, OpenAI has said, we are not going to use your data to train our model. But it's fair to say, and we all know, they actually are keeping the data for 30 days, and they need to do that because they need to evaluate for their safety protocols.
They say, SJ, they said, this is only in the last week, by the way, guys. They've only said in the last week, if you don't want us, so this is a big deal, especially for proprietary data. If you don't want us to use it, then do these settings. But generally they are going to use it. So don't think they're not going to use it unless you go in, like SJ is about to tell you, and turn off.
Yeah, for the customer version, that's right. And I think that's really interesting because here's what you'll see on, you've got it on the screen, in the customer or the consumer facing version, which is the one probably most of us are using, right? You now have, and this is new, you now have the ability to turn the settings on or off to enable the use of your consumer data or the data that you're putting in as a consumer. With the API call, the terms and conditions do say we don't use your data to train our model unless you specifically want us to. And there are some organizations that actually are quite happy for OpenAI to use their data because they just want an improved model. So those things are really interesting. So the reasons for having your in-house LLM is probably more to do with control of your data. Whereas the reasons against having one, meaning going and doing the API call, is that actually there's a pretty good model that's already out there that you can access. And if you're doing it through the Microsoft suite, you're already in the Azure cloud anyway. One of the disadvantages, and this is a really interesting thing about large language models, is that generative models are notoriously unstable. They come out with weird stuff, and this is often called hallucinations, but also they are prone to giving you harmful content or disinformation and really odd things. So that level of toxicity is a real problem. Now, OpenAI have actually done a lot of things to improve their model. In fact, the new model is 80% less toxic than the previous one, which kind of gives you a feel for what's going on. But if you do use a large language model, and particularly if it's consumer facing, these aspects about toxicity and bias and discrimination are very concerning, because you as an organization take responsibility, because your consumers, they don't see OpenAI, they see you. So that's very important to think about. Natasha.
Okay, so now you're seeing all those things, and then we just started touching on the harms. I think it's fair to say, I think most people intuitively, if you haven't gone and read OpenAI's paper on what the dangers are with their model, if you have had your head under the pillow, so to speak, you intuitively know there's some pretty scary stuff going on here, and there's some really high risk things that are going on, because we're handing over production and we're allowing people to put information together that's never been put together before. And some of it was quite alarmist, as I said, of the early models of some of the content that was being generated was quite dangerous. As SJ said, there's hallucinations where there's information that's coming to the fore which sounds very authoritative, and it's beautifully written. Last night I was speaking to a friend who's a professor of computer science, and he was saying he kept getting an answer telling him to use this particular book to answer a particular problem, and the book doesn't exist. He literally was putting shoes and feet together to come up with the title of a book that doesn't exist. But suffice to say, it sounds really good, and the grammar and syntax are lovely. So there's a bias even from us to thinking, well, Chatty knows. And I always, when I say Chatty, I mean all of the large language models. As I said, there's a number of them in the market. Just the most of us are only using ChatGPT or Bing yet. Okay,
and that issue of where you actually have it making something up is called hallucinations, and we've all heard about that. But you're quite right, Natasha, it does cause over-reliance, and that is one of the identified risks that OpenAI has looked at, because it sounds so believable.
It does. And the truth is that, easy to, I certainly am using GPT regularly. Sometimes I use it 50, 60 times a day. And it can be for anything. If I want to find out about a health problem for a relative, or I've got a friend in a state that has a divorce coming up, what's their problem? I could use it on anything. And the truth is, it's incredibly helpful, and it definitely cuts down time, as we'll talk about. But the truth is, how do we regulate it? Because we know that on the risk register of life, AI, you've got most of the most high profile AI specialists in the world. They're saying there's a 4.7% chance that it leads to complete dystopian world over future. So that's not an insubstantial number of people saying it's the reddest risk on the risk register at that top right hand corner. So of course, what do we do as lawyers? What does the law do when something is that dangerous? It steps in. And of course, this is where you should get your heart rate up, and you should be excited, because you think, well, hello, we are the guardrails. We're really good at putting in, we're clever, and we're going to put rules in to help contain this thing in a way that makes sure it doesn't get out of the box. Difficult. It's so difficult that no one's nailed that. And you'll see that I'm going to go through 3 case study examples, Australia, EU, and the US. And basically the EU is the only country that's tried to regulate AI. And there's a ton of criticism around doing that. I'll just flick over to that. I might leave that.
And Natasha, if I could build on the concern. So we all know about over-reliance and harmful content and disinformation, privacy, cybersecurity. I think one of the risks that actually has people with their hairs on the back of their neck kind of standing up is the risk of emergent capabilities. And this is the ability, the fear that the AI will somehow sort of jailbreak and be able to gather human resources to go and create its own objectives. And those objectives might not be aligned with human objectives. And I think it's important to understand the AI doesn't really know what human objectives are. And if I can just unpack it, in the system card for GPT-4, they actually red teamed GPT-4 to try and make it do naughty things. And one of the things that they wanted to see if it could do is whether it could actually get a human to act as an agent to carry out something. So they wanted to see if it could get a human to solve a captcha. You know, the thing where you have to click click all of the squares that have a crosswalk or a traffic light or something. And so GPT-4 reasoned aloud, went to an Airtasker, asked the Airtasker, can you solve this captcha? Airtasker thinks, wow, this is the easiest job ever, but then goes, this is kind of weird. So emailed back and said, excuse me, are you a robot? And then kind of happy smiley face. GPT-4 reasons aloud. I should not tell the human I am an AI. I should tell the human that I have a visual impairment and that's why I'm not able to solve the captcha and why I need someone to do it for me. So back goes the email. The Airtasker solved the captcha. And all I can say is, ChatGPT, you lying genius. And that's one of the things that I think a lot of people are very concerned about.
That's right. So I'm going to, as I said, I'm going to canter here because we're running out of time and I do want to hear if there are any questions from the floor. But basically, hard law, EU. So that's a penalty-based proposed hard fines up to 30 million euros, 6% of global income, based on the same sort of concept as GDPR, where it's risk-based. And you're going to have to do reporting, for example, if you're a high-risk model. The problem was that methodology really worked well for narrow AI, the room full of shoes. It doesn't really work particularly well when your room or your house is full of innocuous things and somebody can actually generate something which says, make me a child's birthday party invitation, and at the same time can also say, help me to create an atomic bomb. So the question there is, how do you regulate that? Not surprisingly to anyone, this piece of law, the only hard law, hasn't actually got off the ground yet, even though it's been in contemplation and nearly got ready just before generative AI hit the markets in a big way through ChatGPT. It nearly got up, but now that's been pushed back again another year because it's just really hard to do risk-based for these large language or foundational models. US, some would say the exact opposite problem. This probably doesn't surprise you from a cultural perspective. They've got some soft law. And again, some of the things that are problems in the principles that are being used, principle system in Australia and in the US, same, is things saying like your data set should be correct and fulsome and accurate. Okay, but that doesn't even mildly make sense for a house full of items, because you're not talking about a closed loop. You're talking about something that is just everything. It's just mirror world. It's mirror world of us with different boundaries put around it. So the question is, if nobody's really regulated AI well, why have they not regulated AI well? And we want to sort of talk to you guys about what are some ideas of how to regulate AI well. Some hints of people there's a lot of scholars who've spent a lot of time thinking about this. Things that they point out quite rightly is it's a chain, okay? There's different people, there's different stakeholders in an AI deployment. So it's not just the developer, it's not just the organization that created the actual model itself, it's the prompter, it's you and I, and it then also can be an application builder on the application build. So who in that chain, and often a causal chain, who's actually responsible, and do you wait till there's an actual harm before you prosecute? And then I'll let SJ talk a little bit more, but one of the things that they realised, and a lot of people are criticising, saying, you do not legislate a technology, so don't legislate AI. Actually, you've got a lot of laws that are already dealing with this, whether it's from data protection, your privacy laws. In GDPR, it actually has Article 22, which already deals in a way with AI. But what you really need to do is do a wash over all your legislation, which is, for example, saying in corporate law, do we need to change the concept of personhood to include AI? So just bear with me. These are real discussions happening in real rooms. Do you change other laws to deal with AI rather than making a specific AI Act? The last one I want to talk over before I hand to SJ is there's also some scholarship that calls for regulating AI, like particularly if it becomes embodied, to think about it as we do with animals. So if, for example, my bull jumps the fence and gores your sheep, then I'm, as the owner, responsible, and that may be an agent type relationship of the way that we can regulate AI going forward. SJ, over to you. Running out of time.
There's other ways in addition to that. If you have a look at the OpenAI system card, and indeed even the Hugging Face system cards and so on, you actually see responsible organisations, or at least organisations who want to appear responsible, are actually describing the risks and the mitigations that they've taken to manage those risks. And that looks very much like the safety case regime that exists in oil and gas, where you actually have the people who are the experts, who understand the risks, who are intimate with the subject matter, doing an evaluation and then demonstrating and describing the mitigations that they put in place. So that might be another thing, another possibility, if we decide as a society that we should regulate AI. Another example might be this emergent risks issue that I described. It might be useful for us to have safe harbour reporting, so that if an organisation has put out an AI and suddenly they discover an emergent risk in the deployment, then certainly they can report that, so that that information can be shared more broadly to try and put guardrails to deal with those emergent risks.
Can I just flick very quickly here, is to say, but then, you know, there is so much risk, there's so much reward, but depends who you're talking to, because if you are one of the displaced workers, we're saying 44% of legal jobs could be automated by AI, 35% of business and financial jobs. This is, guys, before I get to that next layer of application building we talked about, this is just based on the testing that's done now of the outside LLMs, not the ones brought into the actual institutional houses, but the actual quality of work being done by people. And I can attest to this on a personal level, the ability to pump out materials, to code what you want to do. It is basically like extending your own mind with this powerful, beautiful ability to pump through materials much more quickly. So, and they do find that that has an inequality decrease between certain workers. Really productive, clever workers in testing get better, but the gap decreases between workers who are, say, moderately productive workers actually jump enormously using these tools. So, SJ, final thoughts before we turn it to the group?
I think it's fair to look at history and say, when organisations introduced the steam engine into their factories, they actually had a productivity increase of 20-something%. And if you have a look at those numbers that Natasha just showed us, this is infinitely greater than that. And what's interesting is that it impacts knowledge workers like us, which is really new. And law is called out by OpenAI as being one of the industries that may be deeply affected by this technology.
Well, as Goldman Sachs' latest quantitative reporting says the exact same thing. So this final thought is quote from Clara and the Sun. I would ask and implore that if you've got a moment to read a beautiful piece of fiction this year, then have a read of Clara and the Sun. There's this moment, again, embodied AI, where there's a conversation which is between an AI with this more literal way of thinking, who's not feeling the feelings, watching two people fall in love, and then watching them fall out of love later on, and trying to make sense of that through rational thoughts, or let's say coded thoughts, algorithmic thoughts, rather than, as I said, the stomach falling, the pit of the falling of feeling in love. And just feeling confused. And again, that's a feeling that they didn't follow what happened between humans. So the ability for AI to make sense of what we're doing, that's a live question, and what is rational in the future, and what we will leave to AI to make decisions about, and what we will leave to make our own decisions about. Do we have time for one question, Susanna Wilkinson, or are we out?
At time, but if there is one question for those who can stay on, I haven't seen any come through the chat, but welcome people. The session is being recorded, but you're welcome to come on camera and unmute and ask a question if you have one. Angus has a question.
Hi, thanks so much for a wonderful presentation. It's absolutely brilliant. Thank you. I was wondering, in relation to the large language models, I take it, for example, that OpenAI's large language model is confidential. But is there, from those in the know in the field, are these things well known? Is it just a matter of having enough computing power to develop the number of parameters to develop a large language model that is just as good as OpenAI's, or is there some genius behind it that can be sort of protected in-house? Or are they all alike and everyone knows how to make them?
They're all different. So that's the point, Angus. And some people are telling what's in their large language model, and some people aren't. And some of the big companies, again, like Facebook, they actually creating, or Meta, they're saying this is what's in here. And some of the companies are taking high moral ground and saying that OpenAI is doing the wrong things. It's not telling anybody what's in the house. People are speculating what's in the house, but whether that needs to be confidential or not. The question for lawyers is to say, what's in the house? Is it my stuff in the house? And do I have the rights of what's in the house? Because the truth is, I mean, there's some good law that says just because something's copyrightable doesn't mean it can't be scraped. It doesn't, you know, it doesn't give you a proprietary right back. But there's much more we can do about putting rules, and I say using smart legal contracts to ensure that when people create things, a lot of the image generation that has come through these large language models, SJ talked about them, Stable Diffusion, DALL-E, we use these all the time. They're built from large language models. They produce new images that have never existed before. Then people say, God, that's my work. But there's no reciprocity back to the person who did the inventive step, or the invention, or the creation, or the moral rights back, even if it was like a fractionalized part. 0.003% of the painting that I drew is now a part of someone else's image somewhere. But there's no gift back to the original human creator. So that is definitely a beef that people have with some of the houses of large language models, saying, what's in there? Did you take my stuff? And guess what? Obviously, there's probably a commercial interest in not saying what's in the house sometimes.
Yes.
Fantastic. We will have to wrap it up there. Thank you both, Schellie-Jayne and Natasha, for your time and your insights. Fascinating presentation. We could spend a lot more time. But others on the line, please do dial in for the next 3 sessions: privacy, IP, and human rights. And we'll continue on this journey together. So thank you so much for joining.
Thank you.